Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday, where every week we try to give something to help your threat hunting and security program. And today what we're going to dive into is the Cybersecurity Automation Maturity Matrix. We're going to talk about why it's important to measure how mature you are at cybersecurity automation, so you know both where you're at and kind of where you can go, the art of the possible. So let's hop right in. So let's start out first by talking about what security automation is. And for this definition, we actually pulled from IBM's cost breach report. So the last few years in their cost breach report, they had security automation and AI as a category in there. And they have a really good definition for it. And so when we look at what automation means in the security context, it's that ability for the technology to augment or replace human intervention. So it's not necessarily the full replacement, as we'll see. That's why there's multiple steps on the maturity matrix, but it's that side of how are we using technology to automate parts of the security program. And again, this is focused on the containment of incidents and intrusion attempts. And so as we walk through, that's another thing to be mindful of. Where is the automation actually being used? Is this automation just for detection, and then I'm having to go into manual analysis? Because then automation is really only helping part of it. Or am I using automation throughout kind of the whole part of my security program's journey? Such technologies, another note by IBM, a lot of these technologies do depend on AI, machine learning, statistical analysis, automated security orchestrations, things like playbooks, things like SOAR tools that we hear about. But even then, there's a lot of space beyond those. What you'll see on this slide, the other interesting thing from the IBM report, quote in the bottom again, this came out of the 2022 report. You can actually see the breakdown of organizations that reported having some amount of automation deployed out there, whether it be partially deployed, fully deployed. Definitions still definitely up to how they took the survey, so there's a little unknown in there, but you can see groups are actually moving into this. Why are groups moving into this? Automation, there actually is considerable cost savings, both on the monetary cost of breach, that's what you have on the right. On the left, though, on that containment time, identification time, to where if you look at this diagram on the left, you have the not deployed, it took 323 days, 235 days to identify, 88 to respond. You can see as you move down partially and full, again, these were measured. These are IBM numbers measured by them. On the right, you can see the average cost of security breach based on organizations that self-reported to be in those given areas. What's critical when you move into critical infrastructure is not, though, just to think about the detection or the breach cost side, right? You also have to consider the downtime cost. What is the loss of productivity for not having this portion of my network? If you're in industrial operations, that's saying, hey, what is my loss of not having this portion of the plant, not having this key system that I can do business out of, right? In industrial, it's a little more physical, so you can say like, hey, robots don't work without computer. In other spaces, though, that isn't to say that if you're in a pure IT environment, you aren't also going to be incurring losses from not having those systems. But when we look at industrial, right, and these are numbers from Siemens, true cost of downtime, again, 2022 report, the downtime loss, right, is not just that, how much does the breach cost, but also what does it cost to have the plant down? So it's interesting, again, going back to IBM numbers, and again, this is justifying just the reason why having the automation matrix is important. There's benefits both on bringing down detection time, response time, those days of outage, which again costs you a lot, as well as the breach cost side of this. And so really, really big key area to focus in on. Last kind of cool statistic on this slide I found, according to Siemens, wild number, automotive plants actually have the highest downtime cost. In 2022, it was about $2.1 million an hour. It went up 50% from year before, so, or 2 years before. So industry downtime costs are just amplifying. And yeah, so, where we're starting though with this matrix, and where, I think a good model for us to build a cybersecurity automation matrix off of is, similar maturity for automation that's being used in the vehicle world. So the Society of automotive engineers, SAE, they have SAE J3016, which is a publication that defines levels of self-driving cars. This includes like, what does the human have to do in the seat? What does the car do in the seat? What's kind of the interaction between the two? What are those sample features? They developed a very good taxonomy for different levels of automation in vehicles. It's a great place to start because in cybersecurity, right, there is no model right now. There is no fixed definition or taxonomy of measuring automation, measuring the actual effectiveness, seeing how much of the security program it's actually helping. And because of this, right, we have this approach to where everyone's like, oh, security automation, that's just XDR. That's just this detection pipeline. And it's true, right? XDR is super helpful. It's very helpful in accelerating your ability to detect. And if you're in containment, you can see often how big of a problem it is, right? But XDR can only act off of the data in there, right? So if you're just feeding log data to XDR, it's only as good as that log data that goes in there, right? And then that human incident responder has to take over. The SOC has to take over. That group doing threat hunting very manually has to take over, right? And so the lack of focus and rigor on this has led to detection improvement. But when we look at that response side, or when we look at the proactive side, it's almost not studied yet. And so that's why I think it's also important to kind of have the matrix here. Within the SAE levels, so we'll kind of talk through those levels before we talk through kind of the automation matrix we're proposing. But in the SAE levels, there's 6 of them. So SAE level 0, no driving automation, right? Your car, your humans doing it all in the seat. SAE level 1, your driver assistance. Your driver's still doing all of it. The system might be helping with steering, lane control, brake control, that type of stuff, but your driver is at the wheel doing it, right? A lot of cars at this level, right? SAE level 2, this is where most commercial vehicles are that are out on the road, right? The car's helping with braking, acceleration, and steering, but the driver's already engaged, right? You look at Tesla's full self-driving is only an SAE level 2. You look at Ford Blue Cruise, Kia, Hyundai, and Genesis have the highway drive assist. The bulk of your car features for the most part on the main market are at this level. When you get into SAE level 3, you get into conditional driving automation. And in this place, the vehicle's actually handling tasks independently. And at some time it might say, hey, driver, I need you to take over because this is kind of outside of my confidence zone or what I've programmed to work through, right? Good example on this, Mercedes Drive Pilot, right? This was one of the first US brands. It's approved in the US and German highways. What you see here on the left is actually the part of California that Mercedes Drive Pilot's able to work on, and all the way out to Vegas, so you can actually use it to drive yourself out to Vegas if you wanted to. Honda has a version of this that works in Japan. Audi has some versions in here. But again, SAE level 3 is to where the car is doing most of the driving itself, but again, it's probably going to kick over to the driver in certain situations. When you get into SAE level 4, this is where it gets into that truly autonomous zone to where, lifts, they have those Ionic 5s, motionals, those cars actually there's not a driver there. It's autonomously transporting passengers. Note here, it's limited to geographic areas. So while it is autonomous, it's still very much in kind of a trusted small space. When you move into SAE level 5, again, this is autonomous, no limit, self-driving, no user. No cars are at this level now. But again, it's like that holy grail. It's that end all be all of automation. Why we talk through this is it's important to have a matrix to identify, hey, we are only at level 1. We are only at level 2. How do we get to 3 or 4 and 5? How many people are actually at these levels? And what's the true difference between these, right? Again, I like the car example because they do, again, a really good job of dividing them out. SAE is a group of engineers. And so to that point, from J3016, which you can download for free, by the way, they've actually defined out, hey, these certain operations, these users, like this is what defines the different levels between the two, right? We took a stab kind of at today at defining those. The other thing and the last thing that I'll show from the 3016 document is realizing that, hey, some of this automation might also be used at a different part of your journey. And I think as you're adopting automation across your security program, I found kind of this timelining really to be cool as we were working through there, right? So if you're at level 0 from start to end, you're manually self-driving, right? You might start your organization with some level of cybersecurity automation to where, hey, all of my proactive, all of my threat hunting, all of my risk modeling is done completely manually. I have a lot of level 2 at detection because, again, a lot of detection platforms are putting it in. But again, once that detection, once it actually goes into response, I know I'm back at a lower level, right? To where when you get down, right, you might start putting in level 3 or 4 at different timelines kind of in your security program's journey, right? So, it doesn't have to be a one or all. You're going to have kind of features or different parts. But this is a really good model. And again, to the level 3, 4s, you can see down there, the second line from the bottom right, you have a car that is automated driving to pick people up, maybe a little bit of manual driving, maybe there's a little bit of chauffeuring in the middle there. And you can have these situations where you can adapt it across the security program. So how do we adapt this to information security into cybersecurity, right? What I propose is we have to look at 3 given areas to be able to split down the maturity of different automation. We have to look at the scope, right? On this automation, what data sources can it handle? What are the pros and cons of that data sources? Where do I get that data? How easy is it to get? Can I even get it? How do I process that, right? So data sources, visibility, where am I collecting? Am I just collecting at one node in the plant, or am I collecting at enough of the plant to give enough awareness for the automated system or for the automation to come to the right conclusion, right? Because if you don't put good data in to even the best algorithms, you're not generally going to get good data out of there, right? How's it being used? Is this detection only? What NIST cybersecurity framework functions are being pulled in? Is this limited response? Is this proactive or reactive only, right? And so understanding the scope of automation and what that means to you for your security program, that's one of the 3 areas we think we have to look at. Secondly, you have to look at when is human intervention required, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of groups out there, a lot of tools out there that are doing really good automation for detection. And then they're like, hey, analyst, hey, SOC member, MDR service, MSSP. I think I found something, you go figure it out, right? Is it just raising alerts and requiring the analyst to do it? Is it requiring you to activate an incident response retainer? Or is the system actually able to do more proposed actions, right? Is it maybe in the middle there to where it's like, hey, I see this situation, I think it's this. Do you want me to do this about it, right? What is that level of assistance that the technology is providing? What can the automation do alone, right? Are you limited to basic functions like a lot of SOAR pipelines are on, I can set a firewall rule, I can set a domain block, I can do some containment action, isolate this box, throw it off on a VLAN, change other settings, route this packet, right? But it's really only in a very set or a very defined trigger of actions there. Where can these decisions be made, right? And finally, the third area, what level of threat sophistication is it responding to, right? I've sat in a bunch of pitches to where vendors have been like, hey, we detect 0 days. And then you ask them, like, how many 0 days have you actually detected? And the salesperson is like, oh, yeah, I'll have to get back to you on that, right? What is the true number of known versus unknown threats that you can detect? Or those tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? What is that MITRE attack coverage? Where this, again, is important is if you have an attacker that's really good at hiding on the wire, they know you aren't seeing through TLS traffic. Okay, how is the automation going to deal with the downside of whatever data sources you're feeding it, right? Can it find true days? Can it find those hard detection problems living off the land, right? A cool one, living off the land, a lot of popular talks around that. An easy one is just like, hey, the law bins that are used are pretty well known. A lot of them are. And so it's like, hey, can I feed you basically use of all of these executables that we know are law bends or that have been used in the past that have very predictable ways of being called, and can we apply automation right to the command line prompt to doing that, right? So getting into hard detection problems to where today, honestly, again, it's either a human doing it or maybe you have an EDR or AV product that's saying, hey, you might want to look at that. In some cases, the EDR and AV product might actually be making an action and then users complaining because it was a good or bad action, right? But again, those groups are what are going to help us as we actually get into the different levels. As we get into level 0, right? No assistance. Similar to the car one or to the SAE levels, level 0 is basically the analyst manually processing evidence, little to no concern for scale or complexity, right? A lot of this is going to be non-alerting tools, right? Wireshark, it's a great tool. Event log viewers, some of the other tools out there. Great tools, all the work's on the analyst, right? So your scope of automation is going to be tied to low volumes of data at one, or maybe if you're lucky, a few collection points. You're likely either going to be in host or network. Time's going to be your biggest challenge here because the more data you bring in, because you're doing it this way, it's going to take you a ton of time, right? The human is also providing all understanding of the threats, right? The system might provide some ability to extract and present data, but the human's the one that it's all going to rest on here. Threat sophistication, this might work well for low sophistication known threats. You know what you're looking for. You might have some experience. Some might be heuristic based on it, the hairs on the back of your neck. Generally, your MITRE attack coverage is going to be low. It's going to be based on availability bias and just how you think and approach the problems and your stuff. And it's going to be a high time commitment to probably find moderate to high threats in here. As we move up to level 1, though, analyst assistance, right? So the automation's raising alerts to the analyst for action in proactive and reactive cases, but the human's still responsible for actions taken. This is in non-acting analysis tools, things like network security monitoring, passive network monitoring if you're in the OT space, right? These are great products that are great at raising red flags, but they don't really do much, of the like, hey, this is, high confidence, this is what it is, right? It's more like, hey, human, here's an alert, go look at this, right? There have been even tools in the space to where the alert has raised in the past and it dumped a PCAP on the user saying, hey, you might want to look here, right? That is a very good example of level 1. Is it useful? Yeah, there's some use to it. Is it scalable? Likely not. EDR, antivirus, again, XDR in here, threat detection features and forensics tools, right? Some of those tools might say, hey, this looks a little funky. You might want to look at it. But again, it's up to you. And a lot of times, at this level, stuff's hard coded in. Hey, here's a bad hash. Here's a bad IP. Here's a basic kind of rule around this file structure, but it's not definitive on there. Your scope on this, often it's going to be limited to one NIST cybersecurity framework function, right? Hey, this is really good for detection. Hey, this is really good, for this one part, right? But if you want to do anything with it, again, it's up to the user. It's up to you to do something with that. Often it's limited on few data types and it requires the analyst to correlate, right? So again, think like, hey, I have passive network monitoring in place. Passive network monitoring is great. There are a lot of things passive network monitoring can't see. And likewise, there are a lot of things that EDR cannot see or doesn't raise the suspiciousness level to actually alert on it, right? So again, like you're going to be limited to the few types of data, and the analyst is going to have to correlate between the data types, right? Maybe you have some data in Splunk. Maybe the analyst has to go elsewhere, though. Maybe you're pulling memory and other things and doing that, right? Human intervention's required, right? The automation might provide humans with suggestions, but the human has to go collect and analyze that data, right? Sophistication, again, this is good for low to moderate sophistication, largely known threats, low to moderate MITRE attack coverage. And again, there's still going to be a moderate to high time commitment to find moderate to high threats. So it's still not very efficient by time or just by, workforce power. As we get into level 2, right, the automation starts to get some ability to respond, right? Partial cybersecurity automation. So in this case, at level 2, the automation's trusted to take certain response actions, right? SOAR and playbook automation tools sit here, right? Basic ARML, AI/ML blocking and EDR solutions, right? A lot of statistical analysis goes here, or analysis for predefined or known threats in here. Your scope of automation is going to be limited to a minimally destructive, hopefully so. Firewall rules still can be destructive. Adding IPs to denial lists can still be destructive, but generally the scope of things that we let systems do here is very limited, right? Hey, kill this connection if it's this serious, but don't kill it if we're just moderately confident on it, right? It's still often limited to a few types and locations of data. Humans still double checking here. The human still is in that driver's seat, and the actions aren't highly trusted still. And so we talk to a lot of groups that use SIEM and SOAR platforms. One we talked to recently, they were like, hey, I trust my junior analyst actually more than I trust my SIEM and SOAR tool. And that's kind of the level of, there's a lot of skepticism on, okay, hey, yeah, the automation is helping me raise what I can scale, but I realize that again, it's still level 2, right? To use the Tesla analogy, right? While Tesla says it's full self-driving, it's still level 2. The human still has to intervene and is still expected to intervene in cases there. Level of threat sophistication, low to moderate threats, known threats still. You might get some good MITRE attack coverage again, especially as you're going through or across different data types. But still, you're going to have a moderate to high time commitment because the human still is very much in the loop on here. As we get to level 3, we get into the conditional side, right? And this is where the automation's actually driving and making those threat hunting, detection, and response decisions and limited capabilities. It's not perfect. It's still going to defer off in confidence situations to say, hey, this is kind of the outside of the bounds of the decisions that I'm programmed or that I know to push through, right? But it does move you beyond known threat and tactic situations, right? There's arguably enough logic here to where you do truly have the human farther out of the loop, right? Ideally at this level, likely it's going to require both host and network data. Again, there's limitations on both sides of that, but just to be autonomous, it's going to require both. This is going to be used in situations where humans can't scale. So groups that we work with, they're like that. Their number of incident responders to endpoints is, in the 1 to 10,000s point, 1 to 100,000s point, right? So there's just not enough humans if something pops up to actually do on this, right? That said, the human's still going to have to respond, right? There's still going to be poor automation decisions. There's still going to be situations to where the automation is like, hey, I think I have something here, but the confidence isn't quite to where it's programmed to make that decision, right? The advantage here for sophistication, though, is we can get to moderate to entry level high sophistication threats. Why we can do that is the automation's capable of handling more data than the human can handle on its own. We have cases to where you take in 10,000 PCAP files, you take in just absolute high amounts of data, right? If you're doing this at an enterprise level and you're considering the number of network monitoring points you're at and the throughput of all of those points, in the aggregate being terabytes or petabytes or even more a second of data coming through, there's no way a human's going to do that, right? That's where you're going to need level 3 type of automation to get to if you're not just dealing with finding the incident after it happens and going through it, right? This is where, though, the entry points for unknown TTPs via statistical analysis really comes in. You can certainly do it at some of the previous steps. At this step, though, you're collecting a large enough set of data and you're mature enough in how you bring it in that there starts to be some really interesting things you can do just with statistics on dealing with this type of data. This is also where you get into that moderate attack coverage, including some of the hard detection problems, getting into wall bins, getting into like, again, that scaling of dealing with, hey, we now have command lines in near real time, possibly from our entire enterprise. How can we find living off the land off that? How can we find, other attacker TTPs that are known on there, right? That's where you might find a known use of a wall bin, or you might see just entirely new use of a wall bin in here, right? As we move into level 4, again, this is where the human really is out of the seat, right? So the automation becomes completely responsible for prevention, detection, response, all levels of NIST CSF, even some of the risk side, even some of the feedback side. There's still going to be human monitoring in critical settings. It doesn't assume that a human will intervene. The big difference between 4 and 5 is that 4 is used still in limited or some situations, so it's still not generally like, hey, we trust this everywhere. If you're in industrial settings, we're probably far off from getting to 4. It would be awesome if we got there sooner. But the 4 is where it's like, okay, maybe we can start putting this out at some of our plants and seeing what goes in there, right? But again, the criticality of the sites that you put it out at, and how you have to work through it's important, right? Scope of automation, this is going to require you to have significant collection analysis and response automation pipeline. It's not enough to just be able to process data. You're going to have to think, how do I efficiently get what I need off of a host, and deal with kind of that whole, collection analysis response type deal. It's going to require a wide network of collection locations. If you don't do a significant portion of your network, again, it'll only be as good. It'll only know as much as kind of the net that it's across, right? So coverage does matter in all of these. The good news, though, is the human intervention is minimal to none, right? It's acting beyond the scope of technology capabilities. We can get to moderate and high sophisticated threats with this, where sophistication steps up quite a bit. AI, ML, other statistic methods are 100% at play here. And ideally, when you're at level 4, you have nearly complete MITRE attack coverage, including those hard detection problems, right? So in previous steps, it was kind of less because the human was kind of cheating for it and helping it up. When you hit automation level 4, again, the system has got to be able to do this, in my opinion, to be considered a level 4 system. When you get into level 5, again, the big differentiation here, this works in all environments and all situations. And what I added to the bottom, forward leaning on computer architecture and art if possible, right? So there's only so many ways to schedule tasks. There's only so many ways in operating systems to do things, right? And at this level, we don't just want to train it on how to do forensics as we as humans do forensics. We want to kind of train it to say, okay, as soon as that Windows patch drops, we can rerun that behavior model to say, okay, this is how forensics has changed. Hey, these are the new registry keys. Hey, this is how stuff changes. Right now, by the way, forensic analysts still have to do that, right? Versions of Windows do change some of that underlying architecture, versions of other operating systems, right? And so at security level 5, not only are we autonomous on our ability to do that detection, to do the response, to do the proactive work, to do the risk management, but we're also taking a much more computer science-y look into that art of the possible and saying, hey, for some of these operations, for some of these techniques, there's only so many ways to go. Let's dive really deep into seeing what looks weird there to understand that, right? And that way you're going to find, I think, a lot of really interesting stuff in there. So again, today what we talked through is the different levels of cybersecurity automation. We talked about why it's important. We talked about the return on investment. We talked about what groups are doing with it. We talked about the automotive model and how it's being applied to autonomous vehicles and that level. And then we talked about kind of a proposed model for cybersecurity automation. And so hopefully this was helpful. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this below. I know this one ran a little later than last week's, but this was one, honestly, we're really passionate about because we're actually pretty active in the space too. And so it's an interest area of us. We knew it would take a lot longer. Thanks for tuning in. We hope to see you back next week.